All right. I would like to call to order the meeting of the Open Space Board of Trustees for February 11th, 2026. First order of business is to do the roll call. So we will start with the lady to my left, Michelle Estrella.
I am here.
Okay. Brady Robinson.
Here.
John Carroll.
Present.
And I'm Harmon Zuckerman. I'm here. So we have four. Is Sarah on the video?
I am here.
Hi,
I'm
Sarah.
not going to have a camera on today, but I am present.
No problem. Glad to have you. Okay, so we have a full quorum and all five of us. Next item is to approve the minutes. We didn't have a quorum of people who were there at the December meeting to approve the December minutes. So we're going to approve two sets of minutes tonight, I would hope. Does anybody have any comments on the December minutes? None at all, not for any of the pages. Okay, then I will accept a motion on the December minutes.
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion to approve the minutes for the meeting of December 10th, 2025 by Estrella, seconded by Robinson. Take a vote with hand signals. Okay. Yes. Oh, John, you're going to abstain.
I will
Right.
abstain. I was not present.
Right. And I think Sarah has to abstain as well. So we're going to approve those minutes by a vote of 3-0 with 2 abstentions. And then let's take a look at the January minutes. Any issues, changes to the January minutes?
I do have one suggestion on the second page under, I don't know, the second paragraph and the last sentence. So it says, Michelle asked about the wind event and what cleanup was like afterwards. And Dan was talking about how he almost got hit by a branch. But the point there was, and that I would like to make sure was in the minutes, was how the danger of falling branches contributed to the decision to close versus a standard red flag event. Because it wasn't just a standard event, you really risked getting injured, and they even closed the roads because of that. Thank you for incorporating that.
Everybody else all right with that? Okay, I am. Any other changes or comments or corrections to the January minutes? Okay, and let's see. So everyone but Brady was at that, so 4 of us are entitled to vote. But first I'll take a motion.
I'll motion that we approve the minutes from the January 14th meeting as amended.
And I'll second.
Okay, so we have the motion by Carol, second by Estrella, and we'll take a hand signal vote.
Yep.
Okay, and Sarah, can you
Yes.
just say your vote? Okay, Sarah's a
Yes.
yes. So that's 4-0 there with Robinson in abstention. All right. So now before we go on to public comment, I'm going to allow staff to inform us of the rules of decorum.
The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and OSBT, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement processes, please visit this link. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code, including participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any city meeting in a manner that obstructs the business of the meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the meeting or refrain from addressing the board. Only one person at a time at the podium unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No standing in or otherwise blocking the aisles in violation of the fire code or in a way that obstructs the vision or audio of other attendant audience members. No signs or flags shall be permitted in council chambers except for one sign held by a person with the sign measuring no more than 11 by 17 inches, which is held no higher than the person's face. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. We ask that you not affix items to the podium or dais or walls or other surfaces of the chamber. Signs, flags, or other items used to communicate must be held by one person when displayed. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. In-person participants are asked to refrain from expressing support or disagreement verbally or with sounds such as applause or snapping, with the exception of declarations. Traditionally, support is shown through American Sign Language applause or jazz hands. If you are joining in person and would like to speak during public comment or items identified for public hearing, you hopefully have signed up at the table. You can sign up here. Just come flag me as we are preparing to speak. And then if you're joining online, you can raise your hand by clicking the raise hand icon at the bottom. We don't have anyone joining by phone right now. If we do, I'll go through those instructions as well.
Thank you very much. All right, so we are going to move on to public comment. If you would like to speak to the board on any matter of interest to the open space program, may come up.
Okay. First, we have Paula Palmer, followed by Elizabeth Black, and then Karen Holweg. Paula Palmer, if you're joining in person, you can come up to the podium now. Okay, I'm not seeing Paula Palmer online either, so I will come back to Paula Palmer. Next is Elizabeth Black, followed by Karen Holweg, and then Lindsay Sterling Crank. So Elizabeth, if you can.
Hi, Elizabeth Black. Prairie dogs, here we go again. We would really rather be doing something else tonight, but the sad state of OSMP's prairie dog occupied lands brings us here again. My handout that I hope you got covers a couple things not in your packet tonight. I've compiled both a table and a graph for you from numbers staff has reported at annual prairie dog meetings. My table compares the per acre costs of relocating prairie dogs versus PERC lethal control and sums up total removal acres. It seems that costs per acre for both PERC and relocations are coming down, but that's probably because reported acres do not cover the same things every year. The table also shows that on a per acre basis, relocations continue to cost 3 to 7 times as much as PERC lethal control. My graph below the table shows OSMP's minimal progress removing prairie dogs from irrigated land since 2020, when lethal control was first allowed. The brown bars show occupied acres in transition and removal areas where prairie dogs are slated for removal. The orange line in squares shows OSMP annual acreage of prairie dog removals on new removal sites. The yellow line in squares shows the acreage of previously cleared land, which OSMP had to re-PERC a second, third, or fourth time. The red line in squares shows the cumulative average OSMP has PERCed to date, 1,123 acres. The brown bars in the graph show that in 6 years, OSMP has effectively cleared only 321 acres, only 1/3 of its occupied acres, choosing to start with its easiest to clear acres. The remaining 646 acres will be much harder, but in order to effectively clear these first 321 acres, OSMP had to PERC 1,123 acres and relocate 205 acres. 1,123 PERC acres plus 205 relocation acres is a total of 1,328 acres of removals. But this has yielded only 321 acres of progress. This weird math is due to prairie dogs' exponential growth rates, far surpassing what OSMP has steadfastly maintained to you and to council. It's time for a change. You need new tools to successfully clear your precious irrigated lands, especially in a drought year, which brings exponential colony growth. Please completely repeal the spring moratorium on lethal control. OSMP has worked very hard to make progress. They deserve a lot of credit there, but working hard is not enough. You also have to work smart, and it is not smart to keep the spring moratorium on lethal control in place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, we have Karen Holweg, followed by Lindsay Sterling Crank, and then Joel Schapp, pulled with Paula Schuler. So Karen Holweg, I see you're joining online. Karen, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you. I'm Karen Holweg. I'm a former trustee and I live in South Boulder and I'm quite familiar with the proposed disposal property for which there are some pages at the end of your packet for tonight. Those pages prompt several questions that I hope you will ask and carefully consider prior to any vote. First, I would ask, don't the original reasons for acquisition of this property still hold? Shouldn't we still be concerned about preservation of scenic views and entry corridor to Boulder? Shouldn't we still be concerned about the proximity of already preserved open space properties like the Shanahan Ranch, Rolling Rock Ranch, and South Boulder Creek Trail, and connections among these properties? Shouldn't we still be concerned about the possible sale and development of this land? In addition to these original questions, shouldn't safety be considered? Given the ingress and egress to this property off of Highway 93 with its extremely high traffic volume and speed, especially during rush hours. What about the water flows from the west to the east across this property that are shown on the map? 2 ditches, a marshland at the north end, 3 drainages, and of course, some of the land is in, quote, the floodway, according to the memo. Given all this water on and flowing through the property, what does staff mean in the memo when it says encouraging more active use and management of open areas on the property? The staff memo mentions that this was once part of the Shanahan Ranch. Has staff looked into the historic value of the red sandstone house? I understand that Historic Boulder considers it to qualify as a historic structure, and it seems that a bit more research needs to be done before demolition is considered, doesn't it? My understanding is that we still need more ag workforce housing. And I understand that a recent survey has asked lessees about this need. Has Andy Pelster and his group been asked about whether this house, described as in fair condition overall, could or should be used to house ag workers? Is there any such housing, other housing, in the southern part of the system? The last acquisition I heard you discuss and approve was a small piece of land adjacent to the Longmont Diagonal just south of the reservoir. Isn't this property as valuable to OSMP and as important to retain as part of the OSMP system as that land? I hope that all of you will keep asking questions about whether this proposal is appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Lindsay Sterling Crank, followed by Paula Schuler.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Good evening.
Okay, my name is Lindsay Sterling Crank, and I work on prairie dog conflict resolution. I have been working on prairie dog issues for over 20 years, and I live in Boulder, and I used to be the director of the Prairie Dog Coalition, and now I am the program manager for prairie dogs with Humane World for Animals, which was the Humane Society. And I'm telling you that because I'm the one that gets all the calls when the perk machine is out. And so I wanted to let you know that I have received more calls than typical in the last few years after the perk at Eagle Trailhead. And while some folks are not happy with the amount of prairie dogs being killed on open space, myself and many other community members feel our life is degraded, seeing gas go down burrows on our open space that we paid to protect and feel very strongly about conserving our wildlife populations on our taxpayer-supported open space lands. And I want to say that I have been working here in Boulder for at least 20 years with the staff, and I very much appreciate and respect them as individuals and in their professional roles and how difficult of an issue this is. I work in key conservation areas throughout the 12 states and Great Plains, and Boulder is one of these spots. The amount of open space holdings that you have for grassland species is significant and has the opportunity to make a great contribution to grassland wildlife conservation. Before we had lethal management here, which just has been in the last handful of years, we had a no-kill policy. And what that ended up resulting in was your staff learning how to manage prairie dogs non-lethally successfully in many ways. And I feel like with all of this perk machine and all of this lethal control, we're forgetting that we made a lot of progress and that your staff came up with a lot of innovative ways to manage prairie dogs that were successful. I'm also a member of the Shared Learning Collaborative. We lease an acre and we're trying to restore it in the presence of prairie dogs. And we have water, so we're kind of cheating, but it's going really well. And Eric and Andy and the open space conservation staff, Heather and Brian, and everybody's been really supportive. So I have a lot of other things to say, but what I really wanted to express to you guys tonight is that there is a large part of Boulder that doesn't like seeing a native keystone species in decline being killed on our open space lands. And I would just ask that you continue to encourage and support and your staff in developing and continuing to work in these innovative ways. We can't relocate our way out of it. We also can't kill our way out of it. We're going to have prairie dogs here forever on our open space lands, on our ag lands. Figuring out how to do it together and working on coexistence is really the way of the future. I know prairie dogs have been, it's going to be a hard year. We have a lot of drought. We don't have a lot of veg. The conflict rises for everybody when that occurs. So that's mostly what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Paula Schuler, who is pooling time with Joel Schapp. And after that, we'll move on to any hands raised online.
Hi, Paula Schuler, Boulder County, unincorporated Boulder County. As we all know, the last several months have been very warm and very dry. Currently, many watersheds on the Front Range are at 50% of normal. That's frightening. It might be snowing at many ski resorts right now, but that moisture is not beneficial to our watersheds. Moisture could change in the next couple months, but the fact remains that the ice pack and the snowpack are critically low. Ice and snowpack are essential for holding the moisture up high in the drainages and sustaining the irrigation season. A slowly melting snowpack is what carries irrigation systems throughout the summer. Even if we do get a lot of moisture in the next couple of months, whether it be in the mountains, foothills, or plains, there is no guarantee it will make up for the lack of cold weather and moisture that we have missed over the last couple months. 2026 has the potential to be an extremely dry year. Remember that. And now let's talk prairie dogs. In 2024, prairie dog occupation increased by 18% on OSMP lands. OSMP staff called that, quote, a massive expansion, and attributed the expansion to dry conditions. In 2025, prairie dogs occupied acres decreased by 7%, but OSMP also treated 345 acres with lethal control. That's well over the 100 to 200 acres that is typically planned under the preferred alternative. What will 2026 bring in the years after that? No one knows, but dry years equal prairie dog expansion. I do know there will be more dry years and more prairie dog expansion. After 25 years of non-management of prairie dogs by the city of Boulder, there has finally been a change and millions of dollars have been invested in removal of prairie dogs and restoring agricultural land productivity. It has been very successful. Healthy agricultural lands, which sequester carbon, aid in mitigating climate change, and also produce local food and feed are absolutely a priority of this community. In fact, the Boulder County Farmers Market is working to strengthen their partnership with the City of Boulder and establish a permanent year-round farmers market in the heart of Boulder to support local agriculture and provide local food 365 days a year. OSMP has a responsibility to taxpayers to spend money wisely, not waste money doing the same things over and over. I really believe that completely removing the seasonal moratorium and having that tool in the toolbox, being able to manage for 12 months of the year, is truly what is needed for responsible management. It would allow OSMP to restore the agricultural parcels to productivity more quickly, more cost effectively, and in the long run, kill less prairie dogs. The moratorium modifications that have been put into place for 2026 are too limiting, too restrictive, and very labor intensive. In many scenarios, the modifications for 2026 will require 5 site visits per parcel between January and the end of May. That seems ridiculous. What if this ends up being a dry year and another massive expansion of prairie dogs? OSMP needs to move this project closer to completion by managing prairie dogs all year long. I'm asking OSBT to stay on top of the situation and consider asking OSMP to again start the process to remove the seasonal moratorium on lethal control. You may think the problem is solved with this Band-Aid, but I don't, because who knows what the future holds. And since I have a minute left, I just want to say I respect Lindsay as a person. We have very differing views. I'm on the Shared Learning Collaborative also, and I have different viewpoint of what's it's making progress, but it's extremely slow. And I also have a completely different viewpoint of Boulder Valley Ranch and the Eagle Trail. I've lived here in Boulder over 50 years. I've gone out there when it was Hidden Valley Ranch and then Boulder Valley Ranch, and the landscape is completely different than it used to be. It used to be on top, the north part was a healthy grassland. To the east were productive hayfields, and to the west were lush pastures for the horses and livestock. So I don't ride my horse out there anymore because of the prairie dogs. So there are completely differing opinions in the community. And somewhere in the middle is the balance. And the prairie dog conservation acres are beyond their goals, but the ag lands still have catch up to do. So that's all I'll say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll move on to anyone who has a hand raised online. Lynn Siegel, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Lynn Siegel, yeah, I think horses should ride people personally. And I think some people need lethal extermination and to be relocated. You know, these discussions just make huge assumptions that like these lives don't matter. You know, the more you kill coyotes, the more they come back. I went to the prairie dog update and I was thrown off. And to this date, I don't know why. And I asked Dan Burke again, why? Why was I thrown off of, it was shortly after I made my comment. What did I do wrong? You know, I feel like, you know, this is an indictment of the anti-prairie dog people to have things like this happening. These are sentient beings. They live here. We're taking over their space. It's like an indigenous issue. You know, it's like nothing about us without us. What the prairie dogs want. They don't want to be killed. They don't want to be relocated. They don't want to be gassed. There's not enough open space for all the population we're bringing in. With Sundance, Sundance going to be the worst thing that ever happened to Boulder. For 10 years, we're going to be stuck with it. Do you know what's going on down here? Do you open space people? You know, you're just reacting to everything. Do you ever go to a planning board meeting? Do you know that Papilios is going up, that the Millennium is a huge place, 55th and Arapahoe, the National Geographic development. There's just every single corner you look at, you're not going to recognize it. This is human overpopulation. Where's the lethal control? I don't see that at all. I see subsidies after subsidy from the city of Boulder to these developers, pushed right through from Trump. That's what he wants. More, bigger. Read Eben Fodor. Better, not bigger. All this stuff I'm saying, it's so obvious. Why isn't something being done?
Thank you.
If you're joining online and would like to speak, you can go ahead and raise your hand. I'm not seeing any more hands.
Okay. All right, with that, we're going to close public comment, move on to matters from the board. And does anybody have any matters that they want to bring up? This would be the time to discuss the written information item on the proposed disposal of the Hodges property down there on Marshall Road and 93. And it's also a good time to provide any response to anything you heard in public comment if you're interested. So floor is yours. Thoughts? Yeah, John.
I'll go since you have a cookie. On the written information in the packet around the Hodges property, it implies that there may be a conservation easement. I think that's what CE means here. Do we have more details on what that conservation easement might look like? I would kind of expect to see a little more around that in the packet
for March.
So we'll hear
Yeah,
more on that in
there'll
March.
this was sort of an introductory
Okay.
item at this point, and in March we'll, when there'll be deliberations on that, we'll provide an additional memo. And I have made note of several items in which perhaps it would be helpful to expand on some of the information.
Yeah, I think understanding more about what exactly the conservation easement entails would be helpful for next month, as well as, are we looking to carve out the residents from the rest of the property? Are we looking to sell all 10 acres of the property? Little
Yeah,
more
I think the
detail on
intention
that.
right now is that the whole parcel with the residents will be sold subject to retaining a conservation easement on the whole parcel. So the conservation easement primary function will be to address the scenic, to reduce and mitigate potential scenic impacts, but it will address other matters that conservation easements typically address. But we could describe some of the reasons behind the conservation easement, what we're hoping to achieve through it. Again, there's two primary ways that we can protect land. One is fee management, fee ownership. Those are lands that we desire to have a day-to-day relationship with. Conservation easements obviously stay in private ownership, but we have certain development rights associated with those easements in which we could protect certain attributes that are important to the city. And for this particular property, we feel like there's very little management going on from the open space department right now. So that day-to-day management is not something that that we feel is vital to us. And right now the residence is serving little to no open space purposes to it. And it would be a pretty big long-term investment to bring those buildings up to shape. So our feeling right now is a conservation easement is possibly the better tool to protect the attributes we're trying to protect with the property. But we're certainly willing to expand on. I made a notice Karen's comments, and a lot of those were certainly things that we were hoping to address in the memo, and made note to make sure we cover a lot of those.
Okay, so we can expect to see details on what the conservation easement might entail before we dispose of the property?
Yeah, we wouldn't be at this time having the full conservation easement in place, but we could certainly share the subject matters in which the conservation easement would address. And as well as I've heard, and we received some public comments in the mail as well about speaking a little bit more about the buildings themselves. Does it have historic value? and what assessments we've done as staff. We have obviously a couple of folks that specialize in that, and we can bring forth a little more detail about our findings in that area as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so just following up on that comment from John, um, I'm just wondering about the process, Dan. So we're not going to have a vote for disposal until a buyer's been identified and a price has been agreed, right? So the
We
sale
actually
would
are
be
looking for the thumbs up on the disposals and subject to retaining a conservation easement and subject to obtaining and being able to sell it at a fair market value.
okay. So that would not come back to us for an actual disposal vote after a buyer is found and a closing
That's
date
right.
is set?
Yeah, that's typically how we've handled these situations, is that before we would entertain it on sale, before we would spend more resources and then actually bring somebody on board that could then be pulled because there wasn't political will
Right.
to move forward, we would prefer to get the thumbs up on it and then move to those details. But certainly, if you want to put certain conditions on it, subject to a conservation easement that does these things, subject to fair market value. In fact, we might even build some of that stuff into the motion itself, but that would be our preferable way of proceeding.
Okay. Yeah, I think, in some ways, I think that's kind of doing too much of a favor to the buyer. That you could actually find a buyer and say, this contract is subject to approval of the disposal by the Open Space Board and the City Council. So, in some ways, I feel like for me to be 100% comfortable with voting for a disposal, I'd want to see a pretty detailed um, a pretty detailed report from staff and a pretty well baked version of what the conservation easement is going to require before voting on it. So maybe we should reserve a pretty decent amount of time for discussion on that matter.
Yeah, okay. If the majority of the board is feeling that way, I would rather than, and if that's the case, change the approach for the March meeting. We can look back to 2018 and 2019 in which we sold residences in this fashion that I think worked out solidly.
Okay.
But certainly if it's the majority will of this board to have a different approach, be good to know now.
Yeah, and I think I'm just understanding. Sorry to hit you with this in the moment, but I think I'm just understanding how quickly this would be moving forward to a disposal vote, and I don't think I picked up on that in our previous conversations about how this would go. I'm comfortable personally with doing it the way that staff has done it in the past. And worst comes to worst, it looks like we've just got too many questions that are unanswered in the March meeting, and we table it for one more month. That's not going to kill anybody. I don't think we have a buyer already identified, so
No, we wouldn't start that until we got the go ahead.
so if it looks like there's enough information and we're comfortable with it, and the contingencies are handled well enough, and we want to vote on a disposal in March, I'm not saying we need to change the process, Dan. I just
and we're driving our own
Carmen
timeline on
Carmen
this.
and Dan, do you want me to
Oh.
jump in for just a second? Dan, one of the reasons I think that we approach it this way, in order to dispose of this, we have to hire a broker, and in order to do that, we actually have to go through the city's full purchasing policy, which is to go through an RFP and things like that. And so it would be very difficult to identify a buyer and to hire a broker and things without really having that approval. Now, the approval doesn't mean we have to dispose of it, right? So that's where we can say any buyer will have to agree to this reserved conservation easement and the terms therein, right? And so we are definitely able to provide you with some of those overall terms. We likely will not have a draft of a full conservation easement, and that's not typically reviewed or approved by a board. But we can certainly make sure that, terms and feedback are included in that. And so I think from a process standpoint, that's why the approach generally is to get the authority to dispose of it. But if we don't identify an appropriate buyer, if the terms aren't, correct, we don't have to dispose of it. But because in order to get a broker and things, we have to go through that full RFP and things because of the commission that they get. It would be valuable to be able to go this process.
Thanks, Bethany.
Sure.
Ready?
Yeah, appreciate the discussion. And first of all, I just want to say, Dan, to acknowledge that we have supported and even asked you to look at ways we can simplify and have less under management. And so just want to acknowledge that that's what you're doing, looking at properties and ways to simplify our operations and costs and management. So I applaud that. And that being said, I also would like to reserve the right to take a little more time if after March we still have some questions, because it's kind of a big deal. I thought I'd really be curious to dive in to some of Karen's questions. She obviously knows the property well and has some concerns. And so, a detailed staff memo and discussion could be great. And sometimes when that happens, I don't feel like I'm quite there, ready to make a vote. And so I don't want to upset the apple cart and ask you to do a different process. On the other hand, taking a little bit more time with the disposal in a case like this might be warranted.
Yeah, like I said, we're driving the timeline on this. It's self-imposed. If the preference would be to have a 3-step process, an introductory memo tonight, get some initial reaction, a matters from the department as a second step, and then move into decision making, we can certainly build out a 3-step process. I'd want to check in with Bethany and stuff to look at timing. It may not follow month, but if that's the will of this board, is to have more of a matters item prior to a decision, well, we're willing to go back and look at that. Like this is a self-imposed deadline.
I think we should take the time that we need to feel comfortable with it, but I just want to point out that this is a matter that's happening under my term, and my term is ending next month. And then to ask a new board member to weigh in on a disposal right away may be a bit unfair. So to the extent that we can get all of our questions answered by the next meeting and have a vote, I would encourage us to do that, if that's all right.
And I'm open to that. I just want to understand what the conservation easement might cover and get some more detail on that. I think that would get me comfortable voting on it next month.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm fine with going with the typical process, and then if there are just too many questions unanswered at the end of our decision-making meeting, a public hearing in March, that we want to table it to another meeting. Like Dan said, we're driving the timeline, so it's not going to kill anybody. If it turns out that there's enough information, we feel like the questions are answered, and we're comfortable with the direction, the contingencies that have been put into the contract and so forth. Well, we're not going to get to see the contract. And actually, this is a pet peeve of mine. As the land use attorney in me is just crying out for a look at that conservation easement, and I frankly don't really understand why we don't get to see the conservation easement as a board. There are material terms in that conservation easement for how that land is going to be protected for open space purposes after we sell the property. And so I don't like voting on things that I can't read. So that bothers me. But that
Is there a way
said,
to address that? I mean,
it's just staff policy. You just heard Bethany said that's not what they typically do.
We
Can
have.
I say something here? Oh, sorry. Sorry, Dan.
Sure. Oh, Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Sarah. I just want to echo. I feel because because of the things that we're saying are important to this property in that decision that we made in 2017 to acquire or protect the property, and because it's on this corridor entering into the city, without actually seeing a conservation easement. Just sort of voting on the disposal of a property with the understanding that there will be, because the fact that there will be an easement is part of the decision to agree to dispose it. Because of that, I do feel like I just want to echo, I feel like I'd like to see what's happening in the easement. I understand that we don't get to vote on the easement itself, but in order to make a disposal decision, it feels like we should have some pretty solid understanding of what that easement will look like. And maybe there's a way that we can accomplish both things, get it done within the timeline next month and have a pretty clear understanding of what would be in the easement without necessarily having to write the entire easement. I don't know. I would defer.
Yeah, no, we certainly have and can do that. So we have a what we call a standard conservation easement template that's been developed with our city attorney's office. And it's sort of a plug and play document in which all the subjects of what this conservation easement is addressing is outlined. The exact wording for each property is a little bit different based on the nuances and the characteristics of the property, as well as what we're trying to protect. But I think we can be willing to, put forth, a draft template for you all to look at. It wouldn't be the final thing. The final thing would have to be something that ends up being approved by city attorney's office. There could be a couple of wording changes with the buyer that were like, oh yeah, that doesn't affect us at all, and yet it changes at the last minute before closing. So, but I hear the intent, and I think that we could satisfy at least a lot of the intent that I'm hearing.
And I also would say, that I think we need to remember that the city has multiple different apparatuses for the kinds of protections that Karen was asking about in her comments. Like, I'm actually much less interested in historic preservation as a board member for the Open Space Board of Trustees, because if the buyer of the property decides that they want to do a rehabilitation of that historic structure, they're going to have to go through historic preservation in order to get that done. And so for us, I know we have very talented staff, and we have folks who, we met on our retreat, who are handling the historic renovations of wonderful houses that are in the portfolio. But I also realize that maybe we don't need to weigh in on historic preservation requirements in a conservation easement, which is really a land conservation document, when anybody who wanted to make changes to the structure of a historic property has a whole other board that they need to go through, a whole other kind of staff that they need to speak with. So I'm not trying to overreach. I just would really like to know what it is that we're doing here for open space purposes and be really clear that we're comfortable with that before we vote to dispose. So I'm happy with going through the March process. Yeah, I don't anticipate that we'll push it to April or whenever, but I'd just like to have a fulsome report and a good discussion before we vote to dispose.
Mm-hmm. I just want to throw out the possibility that based on this discussion and based on how we want to approach it, that we may self-impose maybe a potential delay. I'm not anticipating it, but I'd want to go back to staff and say, how far along are we with a template, all that kind of stuff. And if we aren't able to provide you with a key piece you're looking for, I'd want to at least be able to readdress that.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And we'll be. I can speak for myself, saying, I'll be happy with whatever direction you choose to take it.
Yep.
Whatever direction you choose to take, it'll be fine.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
I have something separate.
Okay. Are we still on this topic? Okay. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on one of this on the public comment. This is my 59th meeting, and we've talked. We have the annual Prairie Dog meeting every year, so I've been through those cycles a number of times. And we had a speaker today, Lindsay Sterling Crank, come to speak to this board. And I just have to say, where have you been all this time? Not necessarily you, but also your constituents, because I know when lethal control was actually being discussed and approved, there was a lot of people coming up to speak on not doing it. And then I felt like it's been very one-sided over the last 5 years. And I don't know if you all just cried and gave up or whatever, but I was like, where are they? And when I was reading the packet, I saw some of the public comments, and I'm like, oh, they're still out there. And then to see you
Sorry to interrupt, but by they you mean people who are
people
prairie
who
dog advocates.
Yeah, prairie dog advocates and people who opposed lethal control.
Got it.
Because I know it was very divided and very passionate when the approval was still going through the board and the city council, and lots of people on both sides coming up to speak, but it's been really quiet the last several years. And So when I was reading the packet and I saw some of the public comments in there, I was like, oh, they're still there. And then you came tonight and I was like, oh, you're still there. And so you're still here. And so I just wanted to say that that was notable for me. Like you're still out there, you're still carrying the torch, but you've just been quieter over the last several years.
Yeah, I also
It's an
noticed
observation.
so many letters from prairie dog advocates in the packet. Okay, Brady.
I have just a question about the rules of decorum and what happens when a speaker violates those. What do we do? We have these rules. In my view, one of the speakers violated it tonight and offended me. I mean, my offense isn't the violation, to be clear, but can we cut people off when they violate them? What do we do?
So generally, it's the presiding board member, it's the chair whose job it is to cut that person off if they're violating the rules of decorum. I didn't hear a violation tonight that I thought was worth calling out.
Exterminating humans doesn't qualify.
We could go back and look at the rules of decorum, and it talks about threats, and I thought that was kind of a rhetorical, not an actual pointed threat at any individual person. I thought of that too, Brady. That was really, pretty uncalled for in my mind, but not a violation.
Okay.
So I didn't say anything.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Brady, because I noticed that also, and I feel that it's I I just noticed that too. I felt very, very offended by that statement.
Thanks, Aaron. And again, offense isn't the threshold. Right?
Well,
That's the
I'm
threshold.
going to say that for me personally, I felt very offended ever saying that
I did
humans
too,
should
but
be
it's like my
removed or
feelings aren't the issue. But
exterminated uh, in any context is totally inappropriate to have said on a public meeting without being acknowledged. So it may be
yeah,
within somehow rules of decorum, but it was not decorous or whatever the correct term here is.
yeah,
It is offensive and inappropriate to have been said, and I hope that no one who comes onto public comment ever makes a comment like that again.
yeah. Anyway, I don't mean to
No,
call it out, but I just think if we have these rules, we kind of go through them. It's like this incantation at the beginning of the meeting, but there are actually rules, and we need to enforce them. And in my view, they were violated tonight. And in the future, I would like to see us enforce them. But it's maybe a matter of opinion, and you're the chair, and that's fine. I just want to voice my opinion.
Well, I really appreciate your opinion and yours too, Sarah, and I'm glad it was brought up. I'm glad we addressed that because I thought those comments were really, beyond the pale. But I also didn't think that they violated the rules, and so I let the speaker keep speaking. But I appreciate other board members bringing this up, and I'm glad that you did. Thank you. Any other comments from the board? Okay. Take a look at the agenda here. All right, so we're done with questions and discussion on the written information and public comment, and we're going to turn it over to Dan. Dan, it's matters of the department, from the department.
Yeah, we have three main items tonight, and we're going to start off with talking about our prairie dog management program. So kind of appropriate from going from public comment. And we've got a number of staff that will be addressing you tonight. We have some opening comments from our Deputy Director of Resource Stewardship, Heather Swanson, and then we have Brian and Eric, who will lead us more into the presentation itself. I'll just make a note to give you a little bit of spoiler alert. Tonight, we're going to concentrate a little bit more heavily on the restoration side of things, because that's the ultimate goal of these conflict areas, is to bring some ecological and agricultural sort of health back to these degraded lands. And so Eric will be a little bit more of a part of tonight's presentation than perhaps in the last few years. He's always been a part, but a little bit more of a focus tonight. But Heather.
Good evening, Heather Swanson, Deputy Director for Resource Stewardship. So I'm pleased tonight to introduce our annual Prairie Dog update item for you. As you saw, we had our meeting last month and had nice attendance from the community with a wide variety of perspectives on prairie dogs and prairie dog management. And so tonight we have Brian Lieberman, who's our Ecological Stewardship Senior Manager, and Eric Fairley, who's our Agricultural Restoration Manager. And we're really going to have sort of two sections of the presentation. We have an overall prairie dog management program, obviously, as OSMP, but within that, we really do have two programs that are managed in different work groups. The first one is really focused on prairie dog conservation and managing conflict in a cohabitation way with prairie dogs. And so Brian's going to give you some updates on what we accomplished in 2025 and what our goals are for 2026. And then we're going to switch over to Eric, who is really focused on our agricultural lands restoration. And as Dan said, really the point of a lot of our conflict management on irrigated agricultural lands, the real point of it is the restoration and the return of agricultural production to these lands. And so Eric is going to dive into some of the details about what that takes. We've learned a whole lot of lessons over the last few years about what works and what doesn't work, and some of the real challenges to restoring agricultural production to some of these lands. He's also going to talk a little bit about a pretty robust program that we have returning agricultural production and irrigation to properties that continue to have prairie dogs living on them where they have not been removed. So we are going to go through a fairly abbreviated presentation as compared to the degree that information was presented at the public meeting. So your memo does contain a link to the recording of that meeting if you want the full details. We just don't have time tonight for all of those. But anyway, hopefully you'll enjoy. So Brian, go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. We can switch to the next slide. Before I jump in and discuss kind of the conservation and ecology side of the program, I just wanted to give a quick background. This was in everybody's memo, but just wanted to share again that prairie dog management is guided directly and indirectly by a number of regulations and plans. These include the Wildlife Protection Ordinance, Urban Wildlife Management Plan, Grassland Ecosystem Management Plan, the Agricultural Resources Management Plan, and OSMP Master Plan. These documents contain things like population targets and management actions and objectives and approaches to bolster conservation prairie dog habitat while developing conflict reduction strategies for other land uses. As everybody in this room, I'm sure, is aware, prairie dog management has long been an item of community interest and priority for OSMP in the city of Boulder. To keep the community, the board, and city council updated, we've hosted these annual meetings to share accomplishments from the prior year and then goals for the following year. And then after the annual meeting, we've come to the board and to city council to provide updates and then also the feedback that we heard from the community. This year, the annual meeting was held virtually on January 12th, 2026. There were 32 attendees from the general public. Staff presented 2025 accomplishments, 2026 plans, and took comments and questions. For those who could not attend the meeting, there was some pre-recorded meeting material that was available, and then the actual whole meeting was also recorded and posted on the website. Following the annual meeting, we accepted written comments for 2 weeks and received 20 comments that were all included in the packet. Some of the common themes we heard were concerns about the city of Boulder using lethal control to manage prairie dogs and grassland preserves, in particular along the Eagle Trail at the Boulder Valley Ranch property, concerns about negative impacts to vegetation and soil conditions on OSMP properties from prairie dogs, and the associated loss of soil from wind events, and then an emphasis on the role that prairie dogs play in the prairie landscape as a keystone species. Okay, now I'll dive in to share some more specific updates on the conservation and ecology program. We generally focus on mapping, plague and disease management, associated species monitoring, conflict reduction, and implementation of recommendations in the grassland plan and the wildlife protection ordinance. My colleague Eric will follow up with more agricultural land restoration afterwards. To start, I'll share some of the accomplishments for the program in 2025. OSMP staff continued to implement recommendations from the Prairie Dog Working Group despite the loss of a staff member whose dedicated focus was on those implementations. This includes recommendations in the plague management plan. Staff distributed Sylvatic plague vaccine on 250 acres of prairie dog colonies in the southern grasslands, as well as the Stratton property where prairie dogs were trapped for translocation. 198 prairie dogs were trapped on OSMP Stratton property in the northern part of our land system, over 15.5 active trapping dates on approximately 26 acres. These prairie dogs were relocated to the Pueblo Chemical Depot, where populations are being augmented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to support endangered black-footed ferret reintroductions. This past year, OSMP implemented a pilot round of the barrier cost share program. There were 7 barriers that were completed with financial and planning assistance from OSMP to help reduce conflict from on private property near prairie dog colonies. Staff coordinated with work groups and stakeholders to provide guidance on prairie dog protection and conflict reduction during planning and implementation phases for other work groups, city projects, and neighboring stakeholders. We, of course, completed the annual prairie dog occupancy mapping, and we monitored for associated species. Prairie dog associated species are animals that depend on prairie dogs or burrow systems for food or shelter. Some of these include burrowing owls, ferruginous hawks, other birds of prey, rattlesnakes, and small predators such as coyotes and foxes. OSMP monitors these species closely to understand impacts to them from any sort of prairie dog management and to institute any protections such as closure when more sensitive species or rare species are observed. In 2025, wildlife staff identified 7 successful breeding pairs of burrowing owls that produced a total of 21 chicks. And the burrowing owls use the prairie dog burrow system, abandoned prairie dog burrow systems for shelter and to nest. And this was the most the most nesting pairs and chicks observed on the system since 2019. Next, I'll share some results from the 2025 prairie dog occupancy mapping. This mapping has been completed every year since 1996. In 2025, mapping was completed during the fall, and wildlife staff mapped 5,124 occupied acres, which is around a 7% decrease from last year's 5,510 occupied acres. We observed 111 active unique colonies, which is 11 fewer than last year, but we did observe 4 new colonies in 2025. The decrease in occupied acres is likely due to successful control efforts on agricultural lands with irrigated agriculture and to the wet spring, which contributed to higher vegetation growth and is often associated with colony contraction. In this graph, the years with lower occupied acres generally correlate with years that plague was observed on the OSMP land system. As you can see, for the past 10 plus years, plague has not been detected and has generally increased the prairie dog population. As Eric will cover in depth in a couple minutes, the agricultural land restoration program is focused on irrigated lands within the OSMP system. This chart tracks the overlap of areas with prairie dogs and irrigated agricultural fields. 2020 was the baseline year when removals with lethal control in irrigated agricultural fields began. For the most part, this overlap is trending downwards with the few fluctuations with successful removal efforts and successful land restoration. The 2025 number noted here, 615 acres, is already likely lower as removals and land restoration continued throughout the fall and into the winter. The second chart is the grassland preserve occupancy. The grassland ecosystem management plan guides prairie dog colony classifications and management on OSMP land system. The plan also contains occupancy target levels for prairie dogs and grassland preserves, which is generally 10 to 26%. The southern grasslands were below target occupancy for about a decade after plague affected the area, but for the last couple of years, this area has increased and been within our management target. The northern and eastern grasslands have remained above occupancy target levels for several years, but they did decrease from 24 to 25, likely due to successful removal efforts. The Conservation and Ecology Program has a lot planned for 2026. Some highlights include we plan to complete another live relocation project. Completion of this project, as every year, will be dependent on availability of a receiving site. We do believe that the Pueblo Chemical Depot will be an option for a receiving site again in 2026, but it's generally not confirmed until around May or June. Eco staff will work with agricultural land restoration staff to identify the best location, and it'll likely be somewhere on the Boulder Valley Ranch property this summer. We intend to offer a second round of the barrier cost share program. I continue to speak with folks in the community that have interest in this program. So we intend to offer that again, and we'll try to get requests for applications out this spring. We're also going to consider contracting with some help because of the loss of a dedicated staff member to help support the program. And then, of course, we'll complete our annual mapping and associated species monitoring throughout the year. Here's the 2025 spending and the 2026 prairie dog conservation and ecology budget. A couple of things I wanted to highlight where the changes are from 2025 to 2026. Increased budget for the barrier cost share program, inclusion of contracted work to support the program with the loss of a dedicated staff member, and a general increase of costs across the board as we've noticed that these types of services continue to increase. And thanks, I'll hand it over to Eric.
Go. Thank you. Eric Furley with Open Spaces Agricultural Land Restoration Program. Oh, okay. We have two ways of reducing conflict between prairie dogs and agricultural land. One of them is removing prairie dogs and doing associated restoration of fields. And then, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation, we also can do some restoration in the presence of prairie dogs. And so when it comes to removal, especially on these more highly productive irrigated fields, it really is an efficient and efficient first step to successfully restoring these properties. Okay. So in 2025, our staff spent over 1,800 hours operating perk machines for leaf control on these irrigated fields for a total of 345 acres. 250 of those acres are follow-up control, so properties where initial removals happened in previous years, and 95 of those acres are initial sites, most of which happened on Bowler Valley Ranch, but a little bit on Steinbach as well. Okay. Another part of the program is to install prairie dog exclusion barriers. This helps to prevent reoccupation of the removal sites from an adjacent landscape. And so we have two main types of barriers that we use: hard barriers, which we use where we have prairie dogs immediately adjacent to the removal site. And then we use poultry wire or chicken wire where there are prairie dogs in the general landscape, but not necessarily immediately adjacent to. And you find that combination of those two can really be effective of minimizing reoccupation. And so in 2025, we installed 900 feet of hard barrier and 5,285 feet of poultry wire. And then the totals for the project, so 2019 to 2025, we have approximately 13,000 feet of hard barrier and 73,000 feet of poultry wire, and then another 2,700 feet of vinyl, which we don't use anymore. So I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Okay. Our staff, most of which who are here, fantastic job of getting these properties up and running. Some of these properties in very poor condition, and so we have to restore fences, gates. Sometimes we have to redig field laterals or clean them, install diversion structures, culverts. There's a lot of work that happens on the properties, but a lot of times we're working with our neighbors and our the ditch users to improve the ability for water to get to the property. So the ditches that take water to the property have to be maintained and fixed as well. And so there's a lot of work that goes into the infrastructure of these properties. I couldn't talk about all the projects because it's dozens upon dozens per year. Yeah. So to date, when it comes to restoring properties following the removal of prairie dogs, we're looking at 31 sites that we're working on for a total of 1,747 acres. Note that acreage won't equal the prairie dog acreage because we restore a whole property and not just where prairie dogs were. 6 of those sites, or 115 acres, are fully complete. 8 sites, or 211 acres, are pretty close to being complete. Another couple of growing seasons. And we still have a lot of sites, 17 sites, or 1,421 acres, which really aren't going to be completed for another several years, so 2029, 2032, sometime in there, depending on the property. But note that 27 of the 31 sites, or about 1,500 acres, have some level of agricultural production on them. And so as we get closer and closer to completion, those sites just become more and more productive. So it's not like these sites are not being productive. They have some level of productivity on them, whether it's hayfield or grazing. The next 5 slides, I just want to list the properties that we're working on, just so we have that information documented. We have, again, 31 sites, And so, sorry, what these slides look at is the property, the acreage being restored on that property, just like a qualitative assessment by me of the level of productivity at the beginning of the project and then currently in end of 2025, whether the site's leased or not, and then whether it's complete or the date of completion. So like Axelson East, 30 acres, it was mostly productive at the start of the site. It didn't have very many prairie dogs on it. It wasn't in poor condition. We removed prairie dogs, did some restoration. Now it's fully productive and complete. Cowles, 42 acres. It was minimally productive is probably an overstatement. It was leased. It is mostly productive now. That indicates that we've made a lot of progress on the restoration of this site. Still has a couple years to go of just letting that vegetation rebound. So should be completed in 2028, hopefully, as long as we don't have massive droughts. Okay. Gallagher, 72 acres. It wasn't productive at the start. It's partially now, and so half of the property is not in great shape. The other half is in good shape, and so we're actually leasing it this year for the first time in I don't know how long. So we're going to lease the area that's really productive, and so you can see there's a transition happening on all these properties. Totally overall, we're still looking at 2031 for a completion date, just because a portion of that site is still in pretty poor condition. Okay. Oasis, 70 acres. No productivity in 2019, not least. No productivity now. We have a long way to go on a property like that. So we're looking at 2032 before that site is like deemed complete. So you can see there's a broad spectrum of condition of all these sites, and it just depends on the condition of the land and kind of water we have and the year we have and so on and so forth. Okay. Just more sites. I'm not going to talk about any of these, so we can go past that one too. And so our restoration accomplishments for 2025, this includes sites where we're removing prairie dogs and sites where we're doing restoration in the presence of. Gets a little out of order, but that's how it worked out. So we key line plowed on 91 acres. Key line plow is a implement with large shanks in it that's pulled by a tractor, and it just basically cuts slits into the ground. And so it helps with seeding success. It helps reduce compaction in the soil. It helps water infiltrate into the soil and also get spread across the field. So 91 acres, 9 sites. We seeded 681 acres on 26 different sites, treated noxious weeds on hundreds of acres on dozens of sites. Burrow level, 204 acres on 9 sites. Burrow leveling is really important. Those burrows, not only will irrigation water fall into them, but it'll kind of go around the burrow. So it really disrupts that flood irrigation process. And so leveling those burrows is a very essential part of the restoration process on an irrigated field. Composted a couple sites for 85 acres. And then staff actively irrigated 250 acres, 9 sites, 12 different ditch systems. It's a lot of work. Each ditch system comes with its own sets of challenges. And so by working with 12 different systems, it takes a lot of time and effort to be able to get that kind of work done. Okay. Some challenges and lessons learned. The initial prairie dog removal happened very quickly. It happened faster in which we could plan for restoration and conduct restoration. And so we had to do some catch up on the restoration and agricultural and water infrastructure side of things. We also had to catch up on the follow-up prairie dog removal, which is why you see these continued increased numbers prior to 2025. By bringing PERC in-house, we were largely able to address that follow-up control effort. Working on actively farmed leased lands is great because you form a partnership with the farmer, but it's also challenging because how you irrigate a field that's full of grass, like a hay field, is completely different from how you irrigate a barren field, as you can see in the photo. Where you have grass, the grasses spread that water out. Where you have dirt, the water funnels and turns into an erosional feature. Plus, we're trying to water a bunch of seedlings. So it's a different process. And so a lot of times staff will pick up the irrigation because it's above and beyond what you can expect the farmer to have time to do. And then we can control cattle access in some of these properties, but not all of them. They're leased agricultural fields. And so, as you can imagine, cattle can sometimes eat our plants and trample them. And they can also, as you can see in the bottom photo, do some damage to our newly installed irrigation infrastructure. So we knew this was going to happen, but you kind of have to go forward with it and do what you can do. Okay. So program successes. So we're doing a significant amount of work on 2,000 acres of irrigated agricultural land. This is addressing our backlog of ag infrastructure and maintenance work that we need to do. It's improving production on these irrigated agricultural fields. It's addressing soil loss. We all are quite familiar of the dust storms that we get around here. It's addressing that. It's addressing soil health issues, and it's addressing noxious weeds that have been a problem on some of these properties for decades. Bringing PERC in-house has been hugely effective and efficient at um, allowing us to catch up on that follow-up lethal control. There are also a lot of limitations or constraints on getting access to a site. These fields are irrigated. You can't drive a PERC machine on an irrigated field. So by bringing it in-house, we can better coordinate with the tenants for their agricultural operations, as well as maneuver around multiple wildlife closures on these properties. This has also brought attention and support for restoring degraded old field agricultural land. Properties that may not go back to agricultural production, but these are the ones that you get most of the soil loss from. And so this is addressing open spaces, climate plan, solution 1.1 more specifically, the climate resilient agricultural land. So this program has allowed us to have support and resources to get all these properties up and running. So 2026, we are looking to remove prairie dogs from approximately 140 acres on the Boulder Valley Ranch property. As you can see circled on that map, a little bit west of the Eagle Trailhead. So that's good. Sorry. And in addition to all the follow-up control on the other sites that we still have to work on. Okay. I've got another thing, but I'll add it now. It's in the details are in the packet, the board memo, but we are going to do some limited PERC operations within that pupping season as well, starting in 2026. Of course, staff is going to continue with all the ag and infrastructure work, irrigating our fields, fence repairs, seeding, key line plowing, noxious weed management. All this is going to continue in 2026 and for the multiple years afterwards. So it's a lot of work. When it comes to restoring prairie dogs in the presence of restoring land in the presence of prairie dogs, I don't have more slides on this because it's still a relatively new program, and we just need more time to figure this out. But we're currently working on 8 project sites for 277 acres. That acreage actually increases every year. It's a broad spectrum of properties. We have Minnetrista Canino, which is that shared learning collaborative. It's irrigated, it's leased, it's productive, has prairie dogs. We have Axis and West and Teller. They're leased, but they're not productive at all. They're in terrible condition. We have a lot of properties that are not leased. Some of them are irrigated, some of them are not. Some of them are kind of partially irrigated. And so it kind of spans the spectrum of these old agricultural fields. And the Bennett is probably the poster child, I guess you can say. We started this restoration back in 2018 at a trial level. And you can see what that property looked like in 2018. And right to the right there is what that same area looks like right now. We have good irrigation, great staff that allows that site to be restored. But you can see what is possible on an irrigated field in the presence of prairie dogs. Prairie dogs were never removed from that site. So it is possible in certain situations. It's not easy, but it can be done. Okay. That's it. So questions.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Any questions from the board? Or Sarah, do you want to start if you have one, since you can't raise your hand? Well, you can raise your hand, but we can't see it.
I don't have any questions quite yet. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to go first. I might have a question after I hear everybody else, but for now,
sure. Just jump in if anything pops up.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure. Anybody else? Brady?
Eric, Brian, thank you for that. Eric, 2 questions for you. You very briefly mentioned the use of PERC machines during the spring under certain circumstances, and removing the moratorium on PERC use during pupping season has been a big issue that we've been hearing about a lot from the public. And so could you comment a little bit more about what you were referring to, how that's working, where we stand in relation to where we are today, and then the possibility of a full removal of that moratorium?
Yeah, so currently, what we're going to do is do limited perk on properties where we had previous removal and where throughout the winter, so January and February, making sure there's no prairie dog activity on those sites as we roll into the moratorium. So what that's I'm making an assumption of is that any prairie dogs that move in during that time period, March to May, would be non-reproductive females, and so there'd be males or there'd be males or non-reproductive females moving back onto the property, which avoids the situation of having lethal control within the burrows with a lactating female. So you shouldn't have that in these properties. So that's kind of where we're at right now with that. I don't know if I'm the best qualified to speak to, future expansion of that.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a moratorium. There's no official moratorium on that. Really, the space that this falls in is that the city's code and the city's urban wildlife management plan and sort of the city's longtime practice and policy has been around using the most humane methods of lethal control. And in borough lethal control during the pupping season has not been seen as humane because of the possibility that PERC, although very effective, is not always 100% effective with one treatment. And so there's the potential for the adult female to be killed and dependent young to be left in the burrow to die either from exposure or starvation, which has not been seen as a humane method of lethal control. So that's really where the avoidance of during the pupping season has come from. So we really set out to try and find the space where we could avoid that, unnecessary consequence possibly of the inhumanity of that, and while still being able to help move our program forward. And we felt like the benefit was probably the largest actually on those properties that were prairie dog free going into the pupping season, but had individuals move in. And what we found on those properties then is that May is when the young individuals start moving across the property when they need to leave the colony that they were born in the previous year. And if you have prairie dogs in those fields, that's very attractive for them to then go move into those fields as well. So we see a lot of animals moving in that May and June timeframe to those previously removed areas. And so I think the thought is that that actually would have probably the most benefit of lethal control during the pupping season. If in the future we found that that did not have the intended benefits that we thought, we could certainly look into what it would take as a city to move towards a more extensive use of lethal control during the pupping season. I think that would be a broader community conversation and probably not one that staff would just take on sort of internally as we did with this one.
If I might, Brady, if I could just, it's indirectly. So I think there is also the assumption that during those 3 months, like our program area, we just stop and we're just sort of waiting for that 3 month season. I'm just wondering if anyone would want to comment on, what we are doing within this program area year round. I mean, I just don't see our staff sitting around doing their crossword puzzles because it's March 1st all of a sudden. I mean, there's year-round work happening, but I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's busy. We're getting ready for the irrigation season. We are irrigating their fields like any farmer is. So we're cleaning ditches, both on-site, off-site. We're doing a lot of noxious weed management, especially in May, even in April. A lot of our restoration work is a winter thing. So February through the middle of April is massively intense with the restoration and infrastructure work. So there is plenty to do for our staff during that time. But we will also be able to definitely fill in with our crew to do the perk during this pupping season that we've talked about, because it should fit in well with what we're already doing. So.
If I could just add one other thing. As part of this change to the potential for some limited lethal control, I think there's a real, staff are really committed during that January and February timeframe to really make sure that they're putting sufficient resources towards making sure that those properties are clear of prairie dogs prior to the pupping season, which certainly we have always been doing, but I think this is really a renewed focus on that to make sure that we go into the pupping season without occupation on those lands that have been previously removed.
Thank you. And yeah, Dan, I didn't imagine that everybody was just on administrative leave, just sending each other emails, but it's good to remind us that there's plenty to do and people are staying busy during that time. My second question, Eric, is about the Bennett property. You said we've learned some lessons. I think people who are opposed to lethal control would be very curious to know more about the lessons that you've learned and maybe the ability that we do or don't have to scale that on other properties, either because of human resources or finances or the ability, the availability of water. So could you just comment a little bit on the lessons and our ability to scale that across other properties?
Yeah, I mean, you need good irrigation. A site that had poor irrigation, it would be a struggle. We're trying to figure out how to restore in the presence of prairie dogs where you have little or no irrigation. But Bennett, we've been able to get a lot of water out there. Um, Honestly, the lesson learned is just do it. Just seed and irrigate it well. And so, like I said before, it's really important. These sites are barren, and so you can't have a lazy approach to irrigation. You have to be very thorough with the irrigation. If you're an opportunity to irrigate 3 times, you do it because you're trying to restore vegetation on a very degraded soil, and you're trying to do that in the presence of prairie dogs, which eat a lot. So it's a very diligent effort. But restoration is also diligent and takes time. It takes a little bit longer for sure. But really, I think the lesson learned is that I think initially, like, what was going to work? Do you have to compost? Do you have to key line? What kind of plant community do you have to do? Kind of figuring out what plants work and which ones don't, and just get in there, do your seedbed prep and seed and irrigate it well. And that's really a lesson learned, is just do it.
Um, can you remind me? I know I've asked this question before in the past, but why are we vaccinating prairie dogs against the plague? It feels like that's kind of nature's population control, but I'm sure we have a good reason.
Yeah, so the plague management plan was completed 2021, 2022. So we take our guidance from that plan. And I mean, the real goal there is if plague does come through, a lot of times it's kind of total mortality, like total loss, especially if it's a big episode. And so the idea there is that's at least going to safeguard a small population to help reestablish as plague runs through that area.
Perfect. That makes sense. Um, and I know we relocate some prairie dogs to the facility in Pueblo. Um, uh, could you help us understand why we don't just relocate all the prairie dogs to a facility like that?
Um, you be like instead of using lethal control
Yeah.
methods, yeah, it's really expensive and really time intensive to do a relocation effort. Like we're generally focused on 25 to 50-ish acres, and that usually takes, you know, 3 weeks of active trapping, and you can't trap every day because, prairie dogs are only accepted on certain days. There's bad weather conditions. So really those kind of 25 to 50 acres, I mean, that takes like a month and if not more. And yeah, I think it really just comes down to resource intensiveness and also the receiving sites. I think they're happy to accept prairie dogs when they are, but we'd be talking a lot of prairie dogs going down there, and that might be an overwhelming situation for them too.
So it would slow us down pretty significantly if we were
Yes.
to try and do that with more of them.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have any plans if those receiving sites become full and they're not able to take prairie dogs from us anymore? What will we have to do in that situation?
Yeah, we'll continue networking. We already are aware of an additional site that might be a possibility in Wyoming, but there is some calculus there. Like we want to minimize the time that the prairie dogs are in the back of a truck getting transported to a new place. So the short answer is we'll continue networking, and I think new projects do happen, and we would just try to figure out what other alternatives there might be.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this is more of an Andy question, but with respect to the charts you put, or the matrices that you put up, Eric, where you're showing fields that are totally non-productive and now they're somewhat productive or very productive. When it says very productive or more than that or whatever, is that productive of a shortgrass prairie? Is that productive of agricultural products to be sold at market? What's our metric for that?
Yeah, I mean, that again, it's just like a qualitative, uh, what what you'd expect of that site. So it's not relative from site to site. It's just like the first one I mentioned, Axelson East. At the beginning of at the project, it was all vegetated. 90% of that had tall grass. There was a small prairie dog colony, so it wasn't fully productive because that it wasn't fully productive where the prairie dog colony was from a hayfield standpoint. Prairie dogs came off, did some restoration, some infrastructure work. The whole thing is productive from an agricultural standpoint. We do take agricultural productivity numbers. It's Andy would probably be better at answering that than me. I don't know how if it would be accurate enough to be able to say like the increase in productivity was because of A, B, or C. But we probably could get some quantitative numbers for that, especially for certain sites. But mine was more of like just to let you know that we're making progress, and the number doesn't really matter. It's just we're making progress, I guess. So people had an idea that it was still productive or it wasn't at all. Yeah.
And so sort of following along with that, is there a master plan of, what we want out of each one of these sites? Do we want to have a mix of, prairie restoration and, active ag operations and, I don't know, rewilding or, whatever? Like, is that a thought, or, basically are any of these fields, once they're free of prairie dogs, a field that we could lease to a tenant farmer and put ag water on it and start, growing alfalfa or something?
I mean, ultimately, yeah. I mean, if it's an irrigated field, that would be the goal to have it be pasture or hay field or veggie crops, whatever the goal of that property is, whatever that property is best suited for. But there are a lot of properties like Bennett, for instance. If that were to become leased again, probably a pasture, but there are native inclusions that are not irrigable. And so those areas will be restored from a very native grassland context. So it really depends on the site and what that site is best suited for. If that answers your question.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Thank you.
And I'll just add to, the irrigated fields in the grassland ecosystem plan and the agricultural stewardship plan identified irrigated fields as like the best opportunity area for agriculture on the OSMP system. So we've focused our kind of agricultural efforts there, whether it's haying, whether it's, a pasture. And then there's just a lot of land surrounding that we're kind of working as more of like a prairie. And even in some of these areas that are degraded with prairie dogs, we're starting to figure out how restoration could be possible to kind of restore more of a intact prairie landscape. And then other areas, just the focus there is really kind of native vegetation, native wildlife, prairie management.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Sarah, did you have anything yet, or shall we move on?
Are we just in the questions, or are we also doing, do I need to just stick with questions, or can I share thoughts?
Oh, I think you can share thoughts at this point. Sure.
Okay. It's a really complicated issue because agriculture by nature, it disrupts the natural ecosystem. And that's true whether we're talking about prairie dogs or cutting down rainforests, abroad. I mean, there are so many ways in order to set up agricultural lands, we have an impact on the local ecosystem, and then we run into these conservation questions. So I just want to acknowledge that is true, not just in this context, but in the broader context. It felt to me when I was looking at the packet and I was looking at the comments, while I do appreciate seeing the prairie dog conservation comments, it felt a bit skewed because I have, in my own personal OSB, in my email as a trustee, I've received countless. I mean, I didn't take the time to go back and count, but I think last time it was somewhere around 20 last month emails that I received, and that was just 1 month. And I'm seeing a handful of these emails coming in from farmers and also from conservationists who are looking at the fire hazards and the dust and the bigger ecosystem impacts that the prairie dogs are having. So I didn't see those comments in the packet, and I'm not sure why. It was skewed in this direction. If that was just on purpose to kind of balance out what we were seeing in email, or why. But I do think that we have a responsibility because our open space is not just about conservation. Our open space is also about fire resilience. It's also about protecting farmers and farmlands. And so we have to make some really tough decisions. And if I were to just look at it as a map, it seems to me like there are areas where it's appropriate to really conserve. I mean, if hikers and people who are out to be in nature for the purpose of nature conservation are seeing prairie dogs being gassed along the trails, I can understand the upset there. And I don't see a reason, I see there being appropriate management in those areas. And at the same time, really hear the plight of farmers. I hear ranchers that have their cows, endangering their cattle because the cattle can step into those holes. Our costs, I'm looking at these irrigation systems. I'm looking at what it takes to, I'll just say refurbish. I know that's not the correct, to regenerate these lands. Once they're degraded, and when you combine drought and all the things, how realistic is it for us to go run around behind the prairie dogs and restore everything and thoughtfully place them elsewhere? I mean, I'm a conservationist and a lover of animals myself, and I'm also I grew up in a farming family for several generations, and I had some tough love from my grandparents saying, you know what, they're really cute, but those are pests, and we can either eat or they can eat, but someone's got to go. So I wonder, I just don't want to sweep this under the rug. I don't want to, I think that there's a lot of responsibility that we hold for a lot of different stakeholders. And I would like for us to really continue working to honor all of these different pieces, and to be maybe not to have the policy across the city that applies to everything everywhere across all open space. I feel like we can't hide behind that and ignore what people are saying about very real concerns with climate change and fire resilience and dust blowing, as well as those farmers and what they need from us as our tenants on the land, and then our budget realities and what we can do there. So that's it. I don't have questions. I really know how hard the staff is working. I know how much has gone into this. I know how much the community cares, and I like hearing both sides. And I'm glad we saw representation of that in the packet, and then we heard it here today. But what I'm seeing over my past 2 years is that this conversation is starting to skew more and more towards the practical questions. And I think those questions will get louder and louder. And it's important for us to continue to be thoughtful about how we're going to address that side of the equation as well. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. Heather, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I did just want to address what the comments that were included in the packet were comprised of. That was every comment that we received through the dedicated email that we had set up to collect comments on this year's Prairie Dog meeting. And so that was communicated on the webpage as well as in the meeting, that was the mechanism for people to submit comments for inclusion here. So there was no selection done as far as what was included. That's all the comments that we did get.
Thanks so much for clarifying that. And for those of you who don't have an OSBT email account, what Sarah was talking about is that the comments that came through in our packet definitely skewed towards prairie dog advocacy, and the comments that came through to our OSBT email addresses definitely skewed in the other direction towards management. So I think I can fairly say that and be accurate. Any other thoughts, comments? Sarah brought up some pretty important policy issues as she sees them, or do you guys want to move on?
I'm ready to move on. I want to thank you all for a great presentation and discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I just want to say also thank you. That I was surprised to see that we had so many parcels that were in irrigated ag, or that were potentially irrigable, that had become as degraded as they had over time. And I'm just proud of staff and proud of the city for putting water and proper vegetation back on those irrigated parcels. So thanks for the restoration work. Appreciate that.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Heather. All right, we'll be moving on to our second matters from the department, and that is to highlight our funded research program update. And I know that there is a desire of this board to bring in other people than our own staff from time to time, and this is always a good opportunity to do that because we do offer small grants out into the research community, and we have a lot of cool stuff that gets done. So we are going to profile that part of the program and profile a research project. So Ann Lesberg, our senior ecologist, is the person who sort of operates or runs our funded research program, and Katie Suding is one of the researchers that participates in our program. So I welcome them up to the dais.
Dan, I'd be happy to take a 3 or 4 minute break right now and let them get set up. Can we do that? Okay.
Yeah. Hello, OSBT board. Thank you for having me. My name is Ann Lesberg, and I'm a senior ecologist with the Science and Climate Resilience team. And I have with me here Dr. Catherine Suding, Distinguished Professor of Ecology at the University of Colorado. And so today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the funded research program, what we call the FRP. And then we're going to showcase some of the research that Katie's lab has done, especially with grassland fire and fuel research. And then we'll follow with question and answer period. Okay, Leah? Thank you. So the objectives of our funded research program are to inform management questions and knowledge gaps, especially those that inspire conservation and stewardship. The program helps to train scientists and land managers, and it helps solidify relationships with the broader research community. And it also demonstrates the value of research we're doing on OSMP in expanding our understanding of front range protected ecosystems. Leah? So our roadmap for meeting these objectives, go ahead, are to do this through these competitive small grants. And you'll find on our webpage, researchers can apply for these grants. All the instructions are there. And we're on an annual funding cycle. So the funding cycle started last fall when we issued a request for a proposal. And right now we're in the middle of making choices about the proposals. February 20th is our deadline. Go ahead, Leah. In 2016, we also expanded our program, creating an interagency funding program with Jefferson County and Boulder County Parks and Open Space, as well as Longmont Open Space. And the idea here is to increase the area of land available, the diversity of land available for researchers to work, as well as the expertise of those different agencies and the amount of funding. Go ahead. And researchers that receive grants are required to communicate that research, typically through, we got this dance going here, formal reports. Sometimes we also love it when they give presentations and outreach and training with the public. And often we also get scientific publications, and we will come back to the board in mid-April to share some of those publications in a memo. And at that time, we'll also announce who received the funding. And I also wanted to let you know about this opportunity. We will be having the Front Range Open Space Research Symposium, which is jointly with all these other agencies. It's going to happen in fall 2026. We had a little bit of a lag, and this is the first year we'll do completely virtual for our symposium. Go ahead. I wanted to share some funding metrics, but first acknowledge that the OSMP operating budget pays for these grants, and it has since 2014 and on and off before that.
And that would not have been possible without the support of our sales tax in Boulder. So we're thankful for that. Over that time period of 214 to 225, we have an average annual award amount for a given year of about 73,000, but you can see there's quite a range. And the average number of proposals we receive does vary quite a bit, but it's usually between 14 and 15 proposals. That's what we got this year. And the average award amount over those years is about 9,500. But we actually, the max now that you could ask for is 12,000. Just gives you a feel for that. Go ahead, Leah. So to give you an idea of who is receiving these funds, I just did a little distribution, and you can see that most of the funds are going to the academic community, with Colorado University in that hot pink and Colorado State University. But we also provide funds to consultants, nonprofits, small businesses, sometimes in other universities and government agencies. Go ahead. So a quick virtual tour of the types of projects that we fund and we're interested in. We are really interested in projects that have actionable findings that help answer questions about management or threats that we want to figure out how to deal with. So in this first picture, this is an example where Dr. Jacob Koerkamp was funded from CSU to work on the beach property. And on the right there, you see reed canary grass, which is an invasive weed in our riparian areas. It's quite abundant there. And he did research to evaluate strategies to control reed canary grass. And he was looking at integrating grazing with different levels of herbicide. And what he found in this, next slide, yeah, was that using grazing mixed with herbicide at the right dose was much more effective than one of those strategies alone. Thanks. Next slide, Leah. Another thing we'd like to address with our proposals or funds is these gaps in knowledge, particularly trying to understand the diversity, biodiversity of species or habitats. For example, in the last couple of years, we've funded studies of lichens, mushrooms, invertebrates, diatoms. And this particular one was funded to Dr. Owen Martin. I don't know if many of you have seen fireflies on our system, but they're pretty unusual. And he was looking at how their behavior and their phenology, which is the timing of certain behaviors, and they're trying to identify them, how he could do that using volunteers in the community, as well as some high-tech technology using 360-degree cameras, and able to try to understand their flash patterns. And so this is a little firefly flash mob up, I believe this one is at Sawhill. And so he's trying to understand species in a different way by looking at the timing of those patterns. Next slide, Leah. And we also try to ask cutting edge questions. And so we really relish the idea of having people on our system ask scientific questions, some theory, ecological theory, but try to test it out on our system and its unique habitats. Next question, Leah. So this is Tom Merchant, Dr. Tom Merchant now, who studied up on the Tracy Collins Mesa. And he's been asking questions about how do drought and grazing alter vegetation spatial patterns in grasslands. And he's done this in a couple of different ways. In this case, working to add water, it's being sprayed, but also in some of his other sites using different sizes of shelters that keep the rain out in different levels, and then looking at how that integrates or crosses with grazing to explain spatial patterns and condition of our grasslands. So that is my lead-in, because he is one of Katie's former students. So I'm gonna move this over. I don't know if you want to point or try to.
I don't think I have notes or anything, so okay. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about one. So hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so I am I'm a distinguished professor at CU. I'm an ecologist and I love grasslands and study all sorts of things about grasslands. And I've been working with Boulder Open Space for since I arrived here about I think it's been 10 years now. So drought, grazing, diversity, even apple trees and urban tree cooling effects. I would love to talk about all that stuff, but today I'm going to talk about our grass fire project and how important it has been to be able to partner with Open Space on this, as well as the importance of the funded research program. So first of all, just want to acknowledge that I run a large group, and what I'm saying today is done by a ton of different people, from undergraduate students all the way up to postdocs. And that top picture is our grass fire research team, which has included about 10 undergraduates, 3 graduate students, several research assistants, 2 postdocs. So those are people that have gotten their PhDs and are training a little bit more. And one person in particular has been the really the day-to-day lead of what I'm going to talk about today, John Henn, who's in the blue bucket hat. So he's been just absolutely key. So I wanted to start here. So I've been working on grasslands for a long time, and I think just as it probably shocked everyone here, absolutely shocked me, the Marshall Fire at the end of 2021. Um, I was evacuated. There was 1,000 houses lost. I knew people who lost houses. I think it just ramified through our whole community. Um, After kind of the dust settled, though, I realized that it was also a question testing what we knew about grasslands too and the role of fire. So, and I just want to share this one quote, but I think this kind of is probably pretty indicative of how kind of we were feeling. And so this is a quote about from Representative Lisa Cutter. I don't think we realized how much wildfire can impact communities that aren't deep in the forest. It's not something that any of us are immune to. So thinking about our efforts to manage, mitigate fire risks is really a forest problem. And now all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, it is not just a forest problem. So I can take a so I was brought into a lot of conversations with my colleagues at Boulder Open Space as well as Boulder County. And we were sitting around the table and we were like, what in the world? How are we going to answer these questions? What do we know? What do we not know? At first, it was like, it wasn't really because of grasslands and how we were managing them, you know, strong winds, like we can't do anything. And it really rapidly turned into, well, let's figure out what we can do, right? And how we can do anything to avoid some of these future catastrophes like this. So the can just go back a tiny bit. So really thinking about whether we are underestimating the risks of grassland fire in our planning, and then what we could do differently to manage to reduce those risks for the future. Okay. So I'm going to use the same framework that Anne used describing the funded research about ideas about how we were addressing knowledge gaps, then leading on to addressing kind of applied research, and then also taking it to kind of larger scale to cutting edge questions. But first, we realized we had a lot of really important knowledge gaps to address. And so the main one is, are we understanding grassland fire enough to know where the risks are in Boulder and how the grasslands in the open space area are contributing to that? So just a little bit of background about how we understand fire risk. So this is a map of the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, and it's we basically use models to predict where risks are high. And there's three key components to predict fire behavior that's generally accepted: topography, weather, and fuel. When you think about managing a system, you can't really change the topography. Whether you have the weather that you have, and we certainly know that the Marshall Fire was really fueled by really high winds. But the fuel is something that is a thing that needs to be, we need to put in really accurate data to be able to predict the risk. And if you look at this map, you can see some places that are predicting really places that have fast, high flames, hard to control areas. And then other places that are predicting the natural areas probably will maybe support a fire, but really slow, short flames, and much easier to control if there's those short, slow frames. The fighters can make a line and stop those fires. One thing to point out about this is that a lot of the high-risk areas are related to the forests around Boulder on the west side, the Flatirons. And if you look at the grassland areas, they're mostly in yellow. And the only difference between across all the grasslands that we have in Boulder is some variation in topography. And that is because fire models assume that grasslands all have one fuel type and it's very low risk. Okay, so that's what we kind of got together and said, we need to know if this is really the case and whether we're underestimating. So our first knowledge gap, is is it right to assume that all grasslands are the same? We have a lot of variability. So got together and in 2023 coordinated across the county, Boulder County, Jefferson County, Longmont, and the city of Boulder to try to address this. And this is what we did. So all these blue dots are places that we actually went out to the grassland and we measured fuel. So that's in grassland, that is how much the plants are growing, how dry they are, green or brown, how they're structured, whether they'll carry a fire. Okay, so there's 120 plots. They actually go down in Jefferson County, but not showing those. So we started monitoring those to ask that question, are we underestimating? Okay, and so this is our data that we got to start answering that question. And what I'm showing here is the size, the height of the bars is just the number of plots in a given level of biomass. And so you can think about that as fuel for grasslands. And so this dotted line is the fuel level typically assumed across all grasslands in these modeling efforts, in these risk assessments. And I think you can see, but I just want to point this out. So these are 4 different types of grasslands that we really blocked in. So mesic, native grasslands, xeric, native grasslands, smooth brome, which is a very common exotic, more ag-related grassland, and then prairie dog sites. So I can talk to that too. But so if you, go one more. So thinking about all those sites, all those bars that are on the right side of that graph, those are all areas where the fire models would underestimate fuels, and so then the risk of fire. So in general, we are underestimating the risk across most of Boulder, particularly in the grasslands, because of this knowledge gap. One last one. The only place that we're not underestimating.
Do you mind a clarifying question, or you want us to hold it?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brady.
The
sorry.
GR2 fuel model is that line?
Is just
Could you help us?
Yeah.
This is a kind of a way of presenting data I'm not completely familiar with. So could you just walk us through a few more of the details?
Yeah, so that line is what just this kind of typical what fire models have been doing for a long time, what they assumed a grassland fuels would be.
Based on those 4 different categories?
No,
it's all the same?
across the nation. they assume
So the
one
GR2 model is grasslands writ large, all the same.
Yeah, it's a type of fire model,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
And so we're just saying the difference from that. So whether we are actually seeing more fuels would be on the right of that.
So when we see a high bar, that's the number of properties that are right at the, like, for example, prairie dogs.
Yeah,
We've got roughly 15 that are right at the GR2 fuel model, but the vast majority are actually less in that case,
which we would
expect. But
yes.
smooth brome, bad.
Bad, right?
Okay.
Like we're not really realizing that those fuels are actually could carry a fire much more intense, much more dangerous than that, because this is a product not anything to do with Boulder. It's a product of that all the fire work in this nation has been focused on forests, right? And we're just barely now thinking that maybe grasslands are important to think about, right? And so this is a knowledge gap across the board, but it's a knowledge gap that's really important to know for Boulder if we're going to predict risk here, right? And how what to do with the grasslands. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so we can take that information and we can use the information of the 120 points, relate it to remote sensing information, and actually run fire models with the more accurate information. And so this is just one example of how we would predict flame length, which is one aspect of risk. Higher flame lengths, really harder to control, much more dangerous for a firefighter to, hold a line on. And you can, and so we can see the green areas in this area. The only colored areas are the grasslands. The white areas are either forests or most of it is actually urban areas, right? So Boulder is that big white area that I indicated. So we can now say that there's some areas that have higher fire risk than others. How can we use this? We can use this in a couple ways. We can think about how to reduce risk in those higher fuel areas, particularly if they're co-located with areas that have like a high likelihood of ignition, right? We can like prioritize those places to act. We could also perhaps prioritize areas that have a lot of social vulnerability in terms of those would be the areas that we really want to control risk for. But it's more usable information because it really reflects the reality of on the ground. And I just want to say, it also can be modeled with different wind speed, right? Different kind of predictions with other things that we can't control as managers, but it still would be good to run those. We can run those scenarios. Okay. Oh, so then this enabled us to have enough information to then write a proposal to the Joint Fire Science Program, which is a national program run through the BLM and Forest Service, to expand even further. And so the first thing we were able to do with this further funding is actually ask about grassland behavior over time. This is very different than a forest. A forest isn't going to change how much it grows or how big it is year to year. Grasslands absolutely do, right? And so we've been doing these measurements for 3 years now, and we can actually look at these risks. I'm just showing the same flame length map over different years, thinking about what happens with spring. Like if it's a wet spring, how is that going to affect our fire danger in the fall, right? If it's a dry summer, right? And so all those things are reflected now, and we have that knowledge to look at. One thing to point out here, so this is just in October for 3 different years. You look at this October, and I think we all know this, really wet spring, really dry fall, and now all of a sudden dry winter, right? We can't even get out of it. And yeah, so far more areas that are kind of lighting up as risky areas in terms of the grassland landscape. Okay, so then we also were able to ask the next question that our partners wanted us to look into is how do we manage these areas of higher risk? we know what to do in a forest. We can cut down trees, we can lower density, we can reduce things. And also those management techniques in a forest, we can do them and then we can wait for a decade, right? These actions last a long time. Grasses grow back really quickly and we have to do different techniques. And so we really didn't know how best to manage. So, yeah. Yeah. And so we think about something that we do to reduce fuels, we can turn around and 1 month later, is it effective? How is it affecting things, right? And so there's a lot of questions there. So we worked with both the Boulder Open Space as well as Boulder County. We identified 8 different grassland areas, all kind of south of Boulder. And we actually said, okay, let's look. We brainstormed, we thought about what kind of options would be kind of on the table, and are pursuing these experimental treatments where we're actually trying out management techniques, looking at what's going to happen by burning, by grazing is another way we can reduce fuel, by mowing, right? And seeing what the ramifications are and what the how effective it is as a management. Here's just one example about reduction in fuel across those different treatments. And indeed, the fuel reductions vary across treatments, which is one really important aspect about deciding how to manage where. The other things, though, that are really important into making these decisions are these other mission critical. Oh, you can keep. Oh, mission critical things that are also important to Boulder open space, right? So I mentioned about how regrowth could really affect whether something's worth the staff time to do. But also, what if we do this and we're bringing in all these weedy exotic species? We're affecting our biodiversity of these systems. That might not be a management technique we want to do. And also, how does it affect other functions? And one in particular is if we're really going to be hitting these systems hard with management that is reducing grassland, biomass, and fuels, how is it affecting something like soil loss, right? Some other things that we know are really critical to these fields. So those are other things that we're monitoring in these plots. And then lastly, it is a pleasure to be able to work with open space and turning the tables in this question and thinking about how we can bring back good fire into these systems, fire that actually might be beneficial to biodiversity, beneficial to the functioning of the system, but also reducing risk of catastrophic fire. So thinking about prescribed burns on the landscape as a tool. So what we've partnered with Boulder Open Space now for 2 prescribed burns where we have come in before the burn is to take place, take pre-burn data on as much as we possibly can. We're even flying drones to try to figure out the kind of the spatial patterning. Then the burn happens, and then we can monitor what happens afterwards, right? So how beneficial is it? And so that's been also a great partnership. And then lastly, just thinking about even scaling up further and kind of addressing what Anne was calling cutting edge questions. We now have shifted the focus or expanded the focus a little bit. I mentioned it's not just a Boulder problem. So we know that in Boulder, we're still going to get these grassland fires. Here's a picture of a grassland fire that happened on Jewel Mountain land in Jefferson County, but Boulder open space that just this weekend, right? So we know we're still going to have these, but then we also know that they are happening nationally at a much greater rate. So we have now an NSF grant to actually think about this across the whole West and working with other places. And so now Boulder's being kind of this hub as well recognized as the leader in kind of understanding these questions. And so just one example about how important this is, not just in Boulder. Here is an analysis where that showed basically that grassland fires are resulting in way more loss of homes than forest fires over the last 30 years. And so all the yellow dots are actually grassland fires. And all the green are forests. And the reason that this is the case is that there are forest fires, but a lot of times those fires aren't right adjacent to a big, huge neighborhoods, right? And so you can think of risk in many different ways, but just because there's an intense fire doesn't mean that it is damaging or really will affect our community. And so we're shifting the focus to think about these grasslands in that way. And the large NSF grant is helping us do that. So to connect those two, we were able to start with interagency funded research across partners in the funded research project, but then expand it to still some really important local applied research through a joint fire science program. And then now we are even expanding it further to a large NSF grant, but still having it centered on Boulder open space. And then lastly, I just want to acknowledge all the amazing partners of the staff at Boulder Open Space. It has been a privilege to be able to work with them and have my students and trainees work with them. And if I wasn't able to have these partners with the city of Boulder Open Space and these kind of research opportunities, I wouldn't be able to ask these questions. Like, it is a critical partnership across all these levels of different research projects. So I just want to end with just a real heartfelt thanks. It's a great opportunity for researchers like me. That's all I have.
Any questions?
Yeah, thank you guys. That was quite a presentation. Really appreciate it. Do we have any questions? Again, I'll throw it out to Sarah first.
I'm ready this time. Now I know you're. Thank you so much for this presentation. I thought it was really. I'm excited that this research is happening. It seems very thorough and thoughtful. And I love seeing as a CU alum, I love seeing the large teams of students that you're pulling together on that. And I'm so happy that we're partnering here with you as Boulder Open Space. If there's time and it doesn't take up too much of the floor in this moment, I would be curious to hear more about the prairie dog and grassland fire risk, because just to inform myself, because it does come up as I don't know if you heard me earlier. So if we have a minute for that, I'd love to hear your what you found in your research or come across in other research that you've seen.
Yes, I think that prairie dogs do eat a lot of the vegetation, which then makes the vegetation very barren, and a fire doesn't carry over very barren vegetation. So those are the areas that you could say are don't carry a fire, are less risky. So we definitely see that. I think that anytime just going out to a prairie dog colony, it's really not that surprising. But that is something we're finding. We're also finding that some of the high risk areas are also kind of exotic grasslands that are not necessarily the native grasslands. So smooth brome is a very common grassland that is in like old agricultural settings, and that has a very high, it's very flammable, and it also has pretty high fuel loads. And so we're finding that that is also a risk. Those two types of systems oftentimes are also right next door to neighborhoods. So we call that the WUI, right? So you have a neighborhood and then you have Boulder open space, right? And so right there, oftentimes those are the types of kind of critical habitat that we really do need to address in terms of protecting the neighborhoods that are adjacent to open space.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Questions? Brady?
Yeah, it's too bad that applause isn't culturally appropriate here, because I had the urge to clap after your presentation.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. It's just, fascinating, really gratifying. I learned a lot, and I have any number of questions, but I'll just keep it to one. From your perspective, like what are the factors that are limiting our community from getting the best research and understanding what's going on, what are the factors, and then taking management actions that are informed by that research? From your relatively outside perspective from the city of Boulder, looking at different agencies and municipalities, what are the limitations? What's keeping us from moving as quickly as possible?
I'd say that you are moving quickly. I think it's been really impressive how, we talked about it. So funded research in 2023, and that was after a lot of discussions, a lot of brainstormings about what can we do? How can we address community concerns, right? And so I actually don't think it's a case of being reluctant or not willing to try to solve this problem. There is a lot of things that we just don't know. And it's not just Boulder doesn't know, like no one knows, right? And so that's kind of made Boulder have to be a leader in figuring these things out. And so now they're figuring things out for Boulder, but also for almost everywhere else that has these same systems. So it's kind of becoming a leader in that, which I think you all should be proud of too. A couple things that are on my mind in terms of next steps is I think it really thinking about ignitions as well as risk, I think is a really important thing because if we know that it's the high wind driven kind of conditions that are really the scary conditions for fires, really trying to reduce the chance of a fire really getting out of control. We really have to understand both those things together. And that is also something that hasn't been thought about a lot. The other thing that I think is we haven't been able to address, but I think is kind of on the next steps are mowing was really effective in terms of that Boulder Open Space basically started a program and really addressed it. I'm interested to know what will happen with mowing, repeated mowing for like a long term, right? Like, do we have to kind of shift? Like, what is going to happen there? And so, but for a short term solution, great, right? And I think the communities feel much safer because of those actions for open space. And then the other thing that I've been getting a lot of questions about, and I just don't have the answers, are the ditches. So I don't know if you can think about like the open and then these ditches with cottonwoods and stuff. There's real debate about whether those are risky areas, whether they're important areas for wildlife, whether there could be fire breaks if we planted the right non-flammable vegetation, right? So it's just really divergent, and it's all just people. Well, I think it's just all people's opinions because we don't really have much information or much tests about how we can use those to get maintain the diversity of those really important features, but also have them be effective at stopping fire spread. And so I think that's kind of a future thing that might be good to think about.
Before I go to the next person, I just want to say with ditches, it's a real management issue. And, a lot of ditch companies do their ditch maintenance and they leave the spoils on the sides of the ditches just as a matter of practice. And if you're the underlying landowner and the ditch is on an easement through your property, it's up to you to decide whether you want to compost all of that or burn all that slash from the annual ditch maintenance before they turn the water on. Other ditch companies might say, as part of our job, we're going to dispose of this waste. So, it really is. In that case, it's all, what kind of phreatophytes are growing next to the ditch, but what happens to them when they get cut?
Absolutely, right. And so it would be management about, once you make dead material, that is a fire hazard. In California, they're starting to make fire breaks with coast live oak, saying then we can have wildlife corridors, and then we have actually live vegetation that supports diversity that actually stops fire. And so I'm kind of excited to think about like whether we can reimagine doing something a little similar. California is actually a pretty good model for some of what we're experiencing now.
Thanks for this. It's great. Um, you know, of the three tools that you mentioned, and it looked like prescribed burn was the most effective, and then the combination of good burn plus grazing, and then mowing was like the least. Is that right? The least effective. I was trying to remember that chart, but
So grazing reduced the fuel level the least.
oh,
The thing to just think about that is it might not necessarily totally map on to effectiveness because some things might regrow really quickly. Some things like actually grazing is something you can keep cattle on the landscape for an extended period, many months. Or the parcels around here are usually grazed for many months. So that means reduced fuels for an extended period of time versus mowing, right? Or versus fire. So like there's a little bit of, I didn't mean to make that be the only kind of metric of effectiveness, but it is certainly one, right? How far can you reduce it in that one action? So sorry for.
and that's okay. And then the prescribed burn, it seems like that lasts longer. The the impacts of burn.
I'm really excited about Boulder Open Space's willingness to explore prescribed burning. We know that grasslands have evolved with burning as well as grazing. I mean, for millennia, right? And so you're definitely not killing any plants. You're reducing all the dead material, right? You're removing all the, we sometimes call it thatch in a grassland. You're actually sometimes allowing really healthy regrowth, but that's green, right? And so it has a lot of potential for that. It will regrow. And the questions I think about fire are you're not going to burn a place every year, right? So you might need to mix it with grazing. And that's why we're kind of thinking about maybe a combination situation might be really a way to move forward. And then also thinking about weather windows and when to burn that's safe, but still kind of achieves the objectives, right? Is it spring because it's wetter then? Or is it fall, but just in really tight, restricted conditions, right? So, because that's the other thing that is always a possibility. The prescribed burns that we've been doing with open space have been very conservative. No way. The attention to making sure they are safe is super, super high. So I think that we can really effectively kind of operationalize that in the future if we get the information that that's the best way forward.
I know that we have plans and hopes to be able to do some prescribed burns this year.
Yeah, we can even come with some updates in April. Well, we have our next wildfire resilience conversation with you all, and we're making a lot of headway in putting the framework together to have a more effective, efficient prescribed burn program. So we can come with some updates on that. And I just wanted to comment what Katie was alluding to is that throughout the 46,000 acres, it's all diverse. There's some part of our system where prescribed burn would be beneficial that's above a certain elevation height where suddenly the restrictions that are involved in putting down a prescribed burn are much less. And so, but you need a burn plan before you can burn. And so one of the first steps is to start to implement and develop burn plans throughout our system. And ideally where we would love to be is to have a multiple of burn plans. So depending on the current day or the current season, there's variations of where we could maybe have options to do burn based on where the likelihood that we'll actually have a window or an opportunity to do the burn based on all the factors of smoke dispersion and all of that stuff that's required in order to do a burn. So yeah, we hope to come back and talk a little bit more about our burn program that's fastly developing. Not that we've done burns, and we do burns every year in our agricultural lands. I think our next step is to do more broadcast burns. So.
And then just one thing to add about the burns, if we can get data showing that it is effective to reduce fire risk and that we could put them in a model and do some simulations, I think that might help the communities feel like it support those and say, okay, we can deal with some smoke, for instance, because we know the benefit, we have evidence that there is this strong benefit. And so trying to get that kind of knowledge base together, I think is very important.
Thank you for the presentation. These are always my favorite topics when they come up. I know it's getting late here, and I think everyone else has covered what I was going to ask. So just thanks for coming and thanks for the presentation.
Well, I have a million questions. I'm just going to ask one and then I'll make a comment. And so the question is for Katie, and just it's about I think some of the non-native species that we're trying to get rid of propagate with fire. Is that true? And if so, do you have to figure out like where you can burn? Because if you burn a place that's full of seeds that propagate when they get popped, then you're going to make more of those non-native grasses.
So first of all, that is an open question that we do not know.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily that the species are dependent on fire to like burst their seeds. It's not like lodgepole or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it is opening up space in a system. And so whether if a system has that exotic pressure, it could be that when you burn, then there is that that possibility for undesirable species to come in. We know though that in a native grassland, burning is oftentimes the key to keeping it very diverse and very healthy. But I think that's the question about all the management techniques, particularly if you do it a lot, right? When is becoming a disturbance that's not beneficial to the community, and when is it something that is really really beneficial to the diversity? And you can I think that it's really important to think about all those attributes when you're deciding about how to manage for fuels. Because if we only wanted to manage for fuels in open space, we would just pave the whole thing.
Sure.
Or do something stupid, right? Like we have all these different things. And so how we can make all those things successful, we get a win-win, I think is really the key there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying that any of these are necessarily going to cause huge invasive species problems, but just understanding where are those trade-offs and where can we hit that sweet spot, I think is key.
Thanks. Thank you. So yeah, my comment is just I'm just so proud of us. You know, the city of Boulder, the university, OSMP. These are the synergies that I think really make us great. And you wouldn't have such rich academic work to do at the university if you didn't have a partner like OSMP, Katie, and you didn't have if you didn't have a living laboratory right outside of your office, basically. It's such a gift, I think, to us that you're studying this stuff. It's such a gift to you that you've got an opportunity to work with us. And I think in a world where people spend a lot of time tilting at the windmills of waste, fraud, and abuse that they don't even understand. And I see every dollar we spend going to really useful and wonderful projects and great research, and we're supporting the development of all kinds of new knowledge bases. A lot of it has practical impacts that help us. It just makes me proud that we're here and we're doing what we're doing, and just to be the little teeny part of it that I get to be. So thanks for shining a light on your program of funded research projects. I really appreciate that a lot, Ann, and thanks to the department. It's just great.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Yay. I'm energized, even though I'm getting tired. How could that be? So we have one more item tonight, and that's our first touch about 2027 budget development. And I'll just make note as Sam gets seated. that a part of what we want to daylight tonight is a little bit of a different shift in the time frame for when we come to you, based on lessons learned and the right information at the right time and putting it in your hands. And so Sam will go over that, as well as to remind us all of some of the strategic guidance that guides budget development, and then open to questions. Our presentation's pretty short, so how long you want to stay here tonight is almost totally dependent on you all.
Okay.
So it's our fault.
Another one of those timelines that are self-imposed. And for the record, we still have a great shot at being done by 9 o'clock.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, I'm Sam McQueen. I'm the Business Services Senior Manager for the department. Lauren Kilcoyne, the Deputy Director of Central Service, is also joining online tonight. And this is going to be our first touch point as we develop the 2027 budget. And we'll talk more about the proposed timeline and future touch points later in this presentation. We'll start tonight with an overview of city and department-wide strategic budget guidance. Next, we'll discuss implementation of strategic budget guidance and how it informs development of the OSMP budget, sorry. Then we'll review the proposed 2027 budget planning timeline, and we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. Most of the OSBT is familiar with the various documents that we consider strategic budget guidance from the city and department. To norm on some of those documents here, OSMP's budget is informed by the Sustainability, Equity, and Resilience Framework, or SARE, the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, or BVCP, the Citywide Strategic Plan, the OSMP Strategic Plan, and other department plans. The SARE framework provides the highest level of citywide guidance. You've seen connections between the SARE framework and OSMP's budget the last 2 budget cycles, and we expect to continue to share those connections during the 2027 budget process. The next level of guidance is the BVCP. OSMP staff are supporting the planning process to update the BVCP right now. The 2024 through 2026 Citywide Strategic Plan is the next level down, and it identifies priority actions that help inform city work plans and budgets on a shorter timeline. Department guidance provides that more granular level of detail, and we'll take a look at OSMP guidance later in the presentation. To go into a little bit more detail about citywide guidance, the SARE framework identified these 7 high-level goals for the city, and the Citywide Strategic Plan developed targeted strategies under these goals to focus on for a 3-year shorter period. The memo listed connections between the Citywide Strategic Plan and OSMP projects and programs that tie to strategic actions in the plan. We know that the plan doesn't call out everything we do. There are around 40 priority actions in the plan and 400 plus projects across the city. You'll still see stronger ties in the 2027 planning process between OSMP's budget and the priority actions identified in the Citywide Strategic Plan than you have in previous years, and we'll share those ties with the OSBT. Shifting to department guidance, the OSMP Strategic Plan is the highest level of guidance for us, followed by system-wide management plans, trail study area plans, and then integrated site plans, or ISPs. The budget is where all of these plans and guidance really intersect. You're going to hear us talk about our prioritization of maintenance and stewardship in our work plan and budget during the 2027 development process, and much of this is coming from our department guidance. This includes things like asset management, condition assessments, and infrastructure support. This ongoing work informs both our operating and CIP budgets. I want to take a moment to share how we've shown the OSBT connections between plans or guidance and the budget in the past. So the OSMP Strategic Plan identifies Tier 1 strategies as targeted areas for investment. You can also see in the Tier 1 strategies here that we have a focus on taking care of what we have. During the 2026 budget planning process with OSBT, we showed you 7-year capital improvement program, or CIP, investments in each tier of the strategic plan strategies. This is an example of an actual table we included in a memo to the OSBT last year. Overall, you can see investment by tier in the CIP is consistent with the department's goal to prioritize Tier 1 strategies. We'll plan to continue tying our budget to the department's strategic plan strategies and highlight investments by tier in the upcoming 2027 budget planning process. We've also been working to make stronger ties between our budget and the citywide strategic plan. This table shows two examples of the way we connect citywide guidance to our OSMP plans and ultimately the budget. In the first example, you can see the SAFE Priority Action 2A to expand efforts in preparedness and wildfire resilience strategies, in the Wildfire Resilience Plan, or RIP, and then in the total wildfire resilience budget in the department of $3.7 million. The next example focuses on agricultural management. The Environmentally Sustainable Priority Action 9A from the Citywide Strategic Plan has connections to actions identified in the department's Agricultural Resources Management Plan. And then the department has used guidance to inform the $3.9 million budget for agricultural management. I'll turn now to the final section of the presentation, which is our proposed 2027 budget planning timeline. Based on the timeline when internal information will become available and expected citywide deadlines, we're looking to move the timeline back a bit from what we've shown you in previous years. For the last few years, we've asked for your budget recommendation in July or August, and we're looking to move that to September this year so we can come to you with the latest, most relevant information. And walking through this a bit, this current meeting is our first touch point on the 2027 budget. We're planning to have written update for you in May with 2025 revenues and background information. Then we'll come back with a presentation in June focusing on the 2027 financial forecast and draft 2027 CIP and operating budget update. July will be a written update if anything has changed since that June presentation. And then we'll have a presentation again in August and a presentation, public hearing, and recommendation at the September meeting. So just two questions and discussion items for all of you. These were also included in the memo. So the first, of all the connections into the citywide strategic plan, including its strategies and priority actions, what areas do you want to see or learn more about? And then do you have any questions regarding the proposed 2027 budget planning timeline?
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate that. Questions? Ready?
I don't always go first. Sam, that was so succinct. Thank you. Thank you for that. I have a, maybe, I don't know if it's going to follow directly into your questions and discussions. I just have a few points. I was reflecting on a number of the discussions that we had on the budget last year, and I just wanted to bring a few points up. One of them was, it was almost exactly a year ago, we had a discussion about staff including a small financial component in all the reports, which I'm pleased to say that happened tonight when we were talking about prairie dogs. It was up briefly, but there was a budget. It's in the memo too. And so I really appreciate that. I just want to encourage us to continue doing that when we're reporting on metrics and outcomes, including a dollar component. And again, I'm not trying to say that we can reduce every output to a financial input. I don't believe in that kind of reductionist. That being said, I think it's a great discipline. I saw us do it tonight, and I just want to encourage us to continue doing that throughout the year. I think given that that's one of the main functions of this board, it helps prepare us for that vote the discussion and vote that we'll take in the fall. So that's mostly just to keep doing it. Appreciate that. Number two, and I don't know how much this affects the people in this room or the people in this room have anything to do with it, but cost allocation continues to be a concern. We talked about how that was raising from 8.5% to 14% by 2031. We had that discussion last year. As everybody knows, I requested information about cost allocation from the Central Budgeting Office and got a 540-page cost allocation document that the best AI models at the time choked on and couldn't tell me much about. And so I don't think that qualifies as transparency, and I don't want to relitigate all that right now, but I think this board in general is interested in understanding more about why it is that was projected to go up at a straight 5% across the board when we have this incredibly extensive document that purportedly tells us what the right number is. It just didn't make sense. And I think if there was one kind of comment about the presentation tonight in the packet, I don't have any doubt I think you all have incredible expertise that is always going to go beyond me in tracking the various city plans to our actions. And I feel like sometimes our discussions have a lot to do with kind of seeing what it is that we do at OSMP and finding a home for those things within the various plans. Again, you all do that great, and I learn a lot about our planning processes. The thing that I don't see as much, there's a little bit in the memo, but not too much, is prioritization. You know, I see some focus. There was talk about open positions and region, time-bound positions that might not be hired. There's talk about the ranger program and commission rangers, which I don't totally understand. But there's a little bit on the cost side, but then there's also talk about, okay, we just need to understand what revenue is going to be. And I'm really curious to know. We talked about this is another thing we talked about last year. Is there a stop doing list? Maybe again that's too simplistic, but are there things, even given the fact that every action that we have as a home within the various plans, are there things that just aren't as important? I mean, we have to make tough decisions. We can't always just wait for positions to not fill. Listen, I know I'm preaching in the choir, but I would love to see more about that. Like, how are you all thinking about that? Help us understand what the priorities are, and if there are tough decisions that we may have to make in a budget constrained environment. I, for one, would like to know about how you're thinking about that and provide you with input, and then ultimately the cover and support that we'll need to potentially make difficult decisions. That's just the nature of budget cycles. So more prioritization and kind of bringing us into that would be a request. And then one last thing is more prioritization of what you might, if you had to cut something, what would it be today? Or and then again, this is beyond the scope of this body, but I think we basically we take how much, Sam, how many months a year do you take off from budgeting?
I would say none. If I'm being honest, it's truly none. Like we are work planning throughout the year. We have a cycle that we run through, but each piece of it involves some sort of budget development, budget management, and then close out of the previous year budget. So it feels like it's truly all year.
And I appreciate that. And I've had offline conversations with various people within the city, and I think there's a fair amount of support for considering a 2-year budget cycle, so we really could take a breath. And there are mechanisms. And what's the term of art for adjustments, midstream adjustments, Dan? We can do ATBs. It's not like if we did a 2-year budget cycle, we'd be locked in for 2 years. And I think I don't know what you would do with your life, Sam, if you weren't budgeting all the time. Presumably something really productive. I know that's not just, I'm being obviously a little bit coy, but I just think there's other communities that have found a way to do this more efficiently and not have to boil the ocean every year in a budget cycle. And so if anyone in the city is paying attention, for the record, I'm just saying I, for one, would really be in favor of us as a city if it required a ballot measure, council putting it on, or even a vote of the people to get something on the ballot. I don't know that that's a big populist winner, changing the budgeting cycle for our citizens, but I think it would result in efficiency, and I would be happy to talk to council about pushing that forward if you all thought that was a good idea. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Any other budget first touch comments? John, anything? No? Okay. Well, I just want to say I like the overview and sort of what the the strategic and philosophical underpinnings of the budget are and how you start. I think when I was a kid, somebody told me that they start painting the Eiffel Tower and then they get to the top, and by the time they get to the top, they have to go back to the bottom and restart again. So they're painting it all the time. And lately I found out that's not true. They use better paint now, and they only do it every 7 years. But sounds like you paint the tower from the bottom to the top, and then you start at the bottom, so you never really stop. So it's good to know that you revisit the philosophical underpinnings of it annually, and that was good. Thank you. think that's it for the board comments and questions at this point. Did you get the feedback you were looking for, or do you specifically want to have more?
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Appreciate the discussion tonight.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks a lot. Dan?
Just a 1 minute worth of quick announcements. There's going to be a couple of closures of some trailheads where we're going to be doing some more significant improvements to it. So if you see that around and you're wondering, Jeff and his team are going to come. I believe it's in the spring. I'm not sure which month, but to give you an update on CIP trailhead projects, because we are marching along and improving the condition of our trailheads in our system. We got a few more on tap for this year as well. So if you see a closure in the coming months, certainly reach out to me if you want to know about it. But Jeff and his team will be back in to give you a more thorough update this spring.
Thanks, Dan. And by the way, I was over at the Marshall Mesa Trailhead, and they were pouring concrete, and it's really a great looking project. It's really coming together, and you can see all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last couple of years actually happening. So that was exciting.
Great.
All right. Well, with nothing further, I will call the meeting adjourned.